It usually doesn't start with something big. It's a small moment, standing at a checkout line, watching the total climb a little higher than expected. You pause for a second, mentally adjusting. Maybe you put something back. Maybe you don't. Either way, there's that quiet awareness that this isn't as simple as it should be. Or it shows up later, when a bill hits your account earlier than you thought, and suddenly, the numbers don't quite line up the way they did in your head. Nothing dramatic happened. No major mistake. No sudden loss. Just a series of ordinary decisions, leading to a feeling that your money is always slightly behind where it needs to be. And over time, that feeling becomes familiar. What's less obvious is what sits underneath it. Because for many people, the experience of being broke isn't just about having less money. It's about how the system around that money quietly changes. Prices feel higher, options feel limited, and the same everyday things seem to cost more. Not in obvious ways, but in small, repeated ones. You might notice it in the way cheaper options don't last as long, or how paying later always ends up costing more than paying now, or how convenience, when you need it most, comes at a premium. Individually, none of these moments seem important, but together, they form a pattern that's easy to miss, and even easier to live inside without questioning. It creates a kind of invisible pressure, where every decision carries a little more weight than it should. And slowly, without any clear turning point, you begin to pay more for the same life. Not because of a lack of effort, not because of poor discipline, but because there's a kind of math happening in the background. A quiet system that changes the cost of things depending on where you stand. Most people don't see it clearly. They just feel the result. And once you start noticing that pattern, it raises a different kind of question. Not just how to manage money better, but why it feels like the rules aren't the same to begin with. Most people assume the difference is just income. That if you earn less, you simply have less to spend. A smaller number, a smaller life. But it doesn't quite work that way, because the cost of living isn't only about prices. It's also about timing, flexibility, and margin. And when those things disappear, the math starts to shift. It's a bit like trying to move through a city with fewer paths available. Someone with more financial room can take the direct route. They can buy in bulk, pay up front, replace things before they break. They avoid friction almost without thinking about it. But when money is tight, the path narrows. You don't always choose the best option. You choose the one that's possible right now. And those two things are often very different. So instead of buying something once, you buy it twice. Not intentionally. Just because the cheaper version didn't last. Instead of paying early, you pay later. And later comes with fees, interest, or missed discounts. Instead of planning ahead, you react. And reacting is almost always more expensive. None of this feels like a decision in the moment. It feels like adapting, like doing the reasonable thing given the situation. But over time, these small adjustments begin to compound. And this is where the misunderstanding usually happens. People look at the outcome and assume it's about habits. Spending too much, not budgeting well enough, not being careful. But what's often happening is structural. The system you're operating in changes the cost of each move. It's similar to carrying a small leak in a container. At first, it's barely noticeable. You keep pouring effort in, expecting it to fill. But the level never quite rises the way it should. So you try harder, track more, adjust more, think more, without realizing that the issue isn't how carefully you're pouring, but that something is quietly draining along the way. There's also a psychological layer to this. When resources feel limited, attention narrows. You focus on what's urgent, what needs to be solved today. Long-term efficiency becomes harder to prioritize. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it feels out of reach. So the mind shifts into short-term problem solving. Get through this week. Cover this bill. Handle this expense. And again, none of this is irrational. It's actually very human. But it creates a loop where the immediate solution, slowly increases the long-term cost, and eventually, the system becomes heavier than it looks from the outside. Not because of one large burden, but because every small decision is just slightly more expensive than it should be. I remember a period when nothing looked wrong on the surface. I was working, paying my bills on time, even setting aside a little money when I could. From the outside, it felt like things were under control, but internally, it didn't feel that way. There was this quiet tension that showed up in small moments. Opening my banking app in the morning, scrolling through transactions I didn't fully remember making. Not large expenses, just small ones spread out. A ride instead of a longer walk. Food ordered because there wasn't time to cook. A cheaper item that needed to be replaced sooner than expected. Each decision made sense at the time. None of them felt careless. But when I looked back at the pattern, something felt off. It was like I was constantly solving problems, but the solutions never seemed to last. I'd fix one thing, and a few days later, something else would need attention. A bill slightly higher than expected. A purchase that couldn't be delayed. A small fee I didn't plan for. And the strange part was, I was paying attention. I was trying to be responsible. Tracking where my money was going. Thinking before spending. Trying to make better choices. But even with that effort, it felt like the system itself was working against me. Like I was always a step behind. I remember noticing how often I had to choose the "for now" option. Not the best one. Just the one that fit the moment. And over time, those choices started to stack. The cheaper thing that didn't last. The delayed payment that came with a cost. The convenience that filled a gap but left something else tighter. Individually, they were easy to justify. But together, they created a kind of quiet pressure. Not overwhelming, just constant. And that's when the idea started to become clearer. It wasn't that I was making bad decisions. It was that the range of decisions available to me kept leading to outcomes that were slightly more expensive than they looked. Not all at once, but consistently enough that it shaped the result. And once I saw that pattern, it became harder to ignore how much of the experience was coming from the structure, not just the choices within it. After a while, the focus began to shift. Not in a dramatic way. There wasn't a clear moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was more subtle than that. I started paying less attention to each individual decision, and more to the environment those decisions were happening in. Because the pattern wasn't coming from one mistake. It was coming from how often I was placed in situations where the "for now" option was the easiest one to take. And once that became visible, something else followed. A kind of quiet separation between what actually supported my life and what only existed because it had slowly become normal. Some expenses didn't feel like choices anymore. They felt automatic, like background processes running without being questioned. And without trying to control everything, there was a natural pull to make things a little simpler, not perfectly optimized, just lighter, fewer moving parts. Fewer small obligations waiting in the background. And with that, something unexpected started to happen. The sense of urgency around money began to ease, not because there was suddenly more of it, but because there were fewer places for it to go without being noticed. Decisions didn't disappear. They just became quieter, less reactive, less tied to immediate pressure. There was more space between the moment something came up and the need to respond to it. And in that space, things felt different. The same income started to behave differently. Not larger, but more stable. Not stretched across as many directions. It became easier to see what was actually happening, without needing to track every detail. And maybe more importantly, money stopped feeling like something that needed constant correction. It began to feel more like a system that could hold itself together without so much effort. That shift didn't remove every problem, but it changed the texture of them, less scattered, less constant. And over time, that made a quiet kind of independence possible. Not from needing money, but from feeling like every small decision carried the same weight as a big one. And over time, that shift settles into something quieter. The pressure doesn't disappear all at once, but it softens. The constant feeling of needing to stay on top of everything, of needing to calculate, adjust, and correct every move, begins to fade into the background. Not because life becomes perfect, and not because every decision suddenly works out, but because the system around those decisions no longer demands the same level of attention. And when that happens, the experience of money changes in a subtle way. It stops feeling like something you're always trying to fix, and starts feeling like something that simply moves within a structure that makes sense. The hidden math doesn't vanish, but it becomes easier to see, not as a personal failure, not as a lack of discipline, but as a pattern that was always there, quietly shaping the outcome. And once you recognize it, there's a kind of clarity that follows, a sense that maybe the weight you've been carrying was never entirely yours to begin with. That some of the difficulty came from the way things were arranged, not just from the way you responded to them. And in that understanding, there's a different kind of stability, one that doesn't rely on constant effort or perfect decisions, but on a calmer relationship with the system itself, where money is no longer something that constantly demands more from you, but something that stays in its place a little more easily. And in that space, even without everything changing, life begins to feel a little less expensive to hold.